some of the opportunities that she has that you can take advantage of with the NRCS to implement some of these practices. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Xerces, we are a nonprofit focused on conservation of biodiversity by protecting invertebrates. Much of our work focuses on pollinator conservation, especially in ag lands, but we also have a pesticide team and an endangered species team. We do a lot of on-the-ground restoration, outreach, and advocacy for invertebrate conservation. Okay, so as many of you probably know, pollinators are incredibly important in ecosystems. More than 85% of flowering plants require an animal, usually an insect, for pollination and reproduction. So they're very important to our economy, they're important to agriculture, they're important to human health and well-being. We can see that when we look at a produce section. So this is what a produce section looks like normally. And this is what it would look like without pollinators. So you see much less diversity of produce to choose from. And same thing in the dairy aisle. This is what the dairy aisle looks like normally. And this is what it would look like without pollinators. So we can see how important pollinators are to our own health and our own diets. But they're also important in natural areas. They enable the reproduction of many plant species. So any herbivores or other organisms that rely on those plants are going to rely on the pollinators. And then fruits and seeds are a major part of the diet for many birds and mammals. So pollinators are important for all of these animals that are relying on plants for food. There are 6 main groups of insect pollinators: butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, wasps, and bees. And of these, bees are the most important and efficient pollinators. Native bees are incredibly diverse. In the US and Canada, there are roughly 3,600 species of bees native to the US. Most of them are solitary. So unlike honeybees, they live on their own. Most of them nest in the ground. About 70% of bees nest in the ground. About 30% nest in cavities or tunnel nesters. And then about 1% are hive nesting bees, including honeybees and bumblebees. They are a wonderfully diverse group of animals. Here you can see the smallest known species of bee on the head of the largest known species of bee. So they vary greatly in size and shape and color. Incredibly diverse group of animals. I want to take a minute and just make sure that everyone knows that some pollinators are specialists, using only a narrow range of plants, while others are generalists and use a wide variety of plants. So this idea of specialists and generalists will come up later. Some examples of this are this bee, this Andrena bee, only collects pollen from goldfields, this Westphalia species. So there are some bees that are really specific about which kinds of flowers they collect pollen from. And same thing with butterflies. Some butterflies are really specific about the plants that the caterpillars feed on. So monarchs, like shown here, only feed on milkweeds as larvae. So these are examples of specialists. But then monarchs as adults are generalists, and the adults will take nectar from a variety of plants. Okay, so let's talk about pollinator conservation status. I think some of you may have seen this slide before because I took it from Scott Black. He's our executive director, and I know that he used it in his talk he gave at your annual conference. But I think it's a great illustration of what's happening with these big declines in insect abundance and richness. Richness is the number of species we see in a given location. So it's called the windshield effect, right? And I can remember as a kid riding in the car with my family, and I remember the windshield just getting covered in dead bugs, bug guts, and there'd be bugs in the grill, and that just doesn't happen anymore. right? And this is something that I think many of us have experienced over the course of our lifetime, is just noticing this big decline in the number of insects that we hit when we're driving our cars through the countryside. And in the last few years, especially, there have been more and more scientific papers coming out documenting the same phenomenon, but using long-term data sets. So this figure is from a review paper that came out about 1.5 years ago. And basically they wanted to catalog all the papers they could find showing declines in insect abundance or richness over time. So these are long-term data sets. Anywhere where there's a bar means that there was a study conducted. And taller bars, the bigger the bar is, the more studies were conducted in that location. So you can see there are lots of different studies showing these insect declines. Most of them occur in Europe or in the US. There are studies in other locations. What we do know, though, is that the factors that are causing insect declines in the US and Europe are operating around the world, so that it's likely that if we had data, we would see more of these bars in other parts of the globe. The other thing I want to point out is that these bars are lots of different colors, and each different color represents a different order or a different kind of insect. And the fact that these bars are made up of lots of different colors, what that tells us is that this is happening with lots of different kinds of insects, right? It's not just pollinators that are declining. It's not just beetles. It's many different types of insects around the world are showing these declines. So let's talk a little bit about pollinators. We have really good data for honeybees because they're so actively managed. We know the annual rate of honeybee loss prior to 1995 was between 10 and 15% per year. Between 95 and 2006, that number increased between 15 and 22% per year. And from 2006 on, that annual honeybee loss is 29 to 42% per year. So about 30 to 40% of honeybees lost each year. We know less about our native bees. We know less about their status because they're harder to study. As I said, they're solitary. Many of them nest in the ground, so it's not as easy to get information on them. But for the groups that we do have information on, we know that they are also not doing really well. So leafcutter bees, about 50% of leafcutter bees are predicted to be at risk of extinction. 27% of mason bees are considered at risk of extinction. This picture is the blue orchard bee, which is it's a cavity nesting bee that people are trying to rear commercially because they're really efficient at pollinating orchards, more efficient than honeybees. And then about 28% of North American bumblebee species are at risk of extinction. So many bee species at risk. Similar thing with butterflies. We have a lot of good data for butterflies, I think, because they're pretty, people like to collect them, they're relatively easy to ID, and so we have a lot of good data sets for butterflies. These are just a few examples. There's a 21-year data set from Ohio showing a 33% reduction in butterfly abundance over those 21 years. In the UK, a 10-year data set showing over half of all butterfly species have declined in abundance just over that short 10-year period. And then in California, in Northern California, there's a 45-year data set showing butterflies declining at all of the lower elevation sites that are monitored and declines in all groups of butterflies. So many butterfly species declining. This is just a sampling of some of the research showing these declines over time. So why is this happening? It's difficult for any particular species in any particular place to explain why it's declining, but overall, these are the usual suspects. These are the things that are usually at play. Habitat loss, of course, is a big one, leading to biodiversity declines for all sorts of groups of plants and animals. Pesticides are really important in terms of insect declines and pollinator declines. These other factors like invasive species, pollution, changes in land use or land management can also affect insect declines, and of course, climate change. Now I've shown all of these arrows kind of individually going from these stressors to insect decline, but in reality, all of these factors are also interacting with each other, right? The effects of invasive species and habitat loss can interact to affect insect decline. So it's actually really complicated to tease apart, the relative importance of each of these different factors in terms of driving the decline of individual species. I'm going to talk now specifically about climate change. So I think it's worth just restating that 97% of all climate scientists agree that climate change is happening and that it's caused by human activity, specifically the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation. Those are the big two. This is a picture of Grinnell Glacier in Glacier National Park. This particular glacier has lost 45% of its mass in the last 50 years. And many of the glaciers in Glacier National Park are shrinking. In fact, 26 of the park's 37 named glaciers are now too small to technically be classified as glaciers. And I think that number is only going to grow over time. What are the climate change projections for Iowa? And this would be similar for surrounding states. Some of the main patterns we see when we look at what climate change will mean for our weather patterns are we see increased temperatures and increased variability and increases in extreme events. So for Iowa, we're going to see warmer temperatures, especially in the spring and winter, more so than in summer, and an increased number of days with extreme temperatures. So increased number of heat waves, for example. Precipitation, we'll see increases in extreme precipitation events, so big rain events, especially in winter and spring. More extreme weather events, including storms, flooding, and drought. Drought is expected to become more intense. With flooding, we expect an increased intensity and frequency of floods. Now, the magnitude of these effects and the time at which they start to become really common will be lower if we keep warming to lower levels, right? So the magnitude of these effects depend on the magnitude of climate change. So for example, if we can keep warming to 2 degrees Celsius, which is the goal of the Paris agreements, then these effects will be less extreme and it will be much later in the century before we start to see these effects become really intense. Now, when we talk about warming, I said the goal of the Paris Agreement is to keep warming to 2 degrees Celsius. What does that mean? When we talk about warming in this way, we're talking about the average global temperature. So we're talking about the average temperature everywhere on Earth, from the Sahara Desert to Antarctica. So all of those locations average together. And then it's relative to pre-industrial temperatures. So the average global temperature has already increased 1 degree relative to pre-industrial times. As I said, the Paris Agreement is, the goal of that is to keep warming to 2 degrees or less. Currently, we're on track to hit 3 to 4 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century, which would be catastrophic. And I'm not being alarmist or exaggerating, I think, when I use that word. As a point of comparison, because it sounds like such a small number, but it actually means really big numbers locally. To compare, the change in the average global temperature between an ice age and a warm period is between 4 and 6 degrees Celsius. So also a very small change in average global temperature, but a big change locally, right? So we're looking at a similar magnitude of change, but instead of going from cold to warm, we're talking about going from warm to hot. So big change, even though it seems like a small number. This obviously is going to have profound effects on our economy, on our health, on our environment. let's talk about what kinds of effects climate change can have on pollinators, because there's actually a whole variety of ways that climate change can affect pollinators. The first one is it can affect their physiology. So insects are really sensitive to temperature, and it influences all sorts of biological processes. So if we increase temperature with climate change, we can increase, or it has effects on all sorts of things like survival rates. It can affect reproduction rates. It can affect how fast insects grow. It can affect how big they are at maturity, but it can also affect things like their digestion rates and how much food they need to eat to keep up their metabolism. When are they active during the day? How long can they be active? All of those things are influenced by temperature. And so in some ways, small increases in temperature might not be a big deal, but what happens, the worry is that when temperatures get really high and it pushes animals towards their thermal tolerance limits. So if it gets too high, it gets to those limits, and then the animals can start to shut down, right? Or it could even be lethal. And so the concern there is with extended heat waves or increased temperatures can push animals towards those thermal tolerance limits and start to have really negative effects on their performance. Range shifts are another expected response of species to climate change, including pollinators. So the idea is that species may shift their distributions to track the climate that they've been adapted to. So in general, species are predicted to move poleward, so in our case, farther north, and to higher altitudes, to try and track those conditions that they've been adapted to. Not all species will move, and not all species will change in that way. So for example, with bumblebees, we haven't seen a northward shift with bumblebees in North America, but we are observing that some of the southern parts of their ranges are starting to contract. This is obviously problematic for species that already occur at high altitudes or high latitudes because they don't really have any room to move. And this is also an issue that's exacerbated by by habitat loss. So I talked about how these different stressors interact. Well, in order for a species to shift its distribution, it needs habitat to move to, and it needs habitat to move through. So if habitat loss is a big problem, it may be very difficult for some types of species to move and shift their distributions to try and track the climate conditions that they've adapted to. Phenology is another thing that may respond to climate change. So phenology is a fancy word that means the timing of biological events. So the timing of bud burst in the spring, or the timing of when monarchs migrate from their overwintering sites. With pollinators, the concern is that there might be a mismatch between pollinators and their plants. So for example, especially with specialist pollinators, that maybe their emergence is timed to match the flowering time of a particular plant that they specialize on. If the pollinators and the plants are responding to different cues to tell them when to emerge, then you can get a mismatch. So for example, if a plant flowering time is predicted by day length and the pollinator emergence time is predicted by temperature, then you can potentially get a mismatch, which would then have negative consequences for the pollinator and the plants that rely on them. Early season bees might be especially vulnerable to this, especially if we get really warm winter and they emerge early and then there's a frost or something comes through, that can be bad for those bees. Of course, plants are also going to respond to climate change, and so those effects on plants will then indirectly affect pollinators. So climate change can affect the quantity of plants in the environment. You could think about responses to drought or heat waves could affect the number of flowering plants on the landscape. It can affect the quality of those plants for the pollinators. Again, with a drought, plants are going to be producing a lot of high quality nectar and pollen. But there's also some really cool studies showing that increases in that amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, like those types of changes can also affect things like the nutritional composition of nectar and pollen. So that can change the quality of those plants for pollinators. And also things like attractiveness to pollinators can be affected by carbon dioxide and also temperature. So there's some interesting things happening there. And then of course, if the plant diversity changes, as these plants are responding to climate change, some plants may become more common, some plants may become more rare. And as that changes, that's going to affect the composition of the pollinators that are pollinating that plant community, especially if you've got some specialist pollinators that are relying on particular types of plants. Those plants become more or less common. That's going to affect the pollinator population. And I sort of alluded to this before, but climate change can affect species interactions. It can affect the way predator-prey interactions play out, host-parasite interactions, disease. There's some diseases that are more virulent at higher temperatures. So those things can change when you change the temperature. And it can also affect things like competitive interactions between different pollinators. And so then maybe you see shifts in the pollinator community in response to all of these factors. So all of these things can interact, right? Climate change is likely to impact pollinators in many different ways, and these effects can interact. But the effects of climate change can also interact with other stressors. So this photo, this is a bumblebee die-off that happened after a flowering tree was sprayed with neonicotinoids. So this is just a, I guess an illustration of pesticide use, but pesticide use is expected to increase with climate change. And so that's an additional stressor there. You've got climate change, you've got pesticide use, you've got habitat loss, invasive species, you've got all of these different stressors, and they can interact with each other and sort of magnify the effects of any one of these stressors. When you put them all together, it can maybe have really large effects on pollinators. So who is at risk? Which species are most vulnerable to climate change? In general, we expect specialist species to be more vulnerable to climate change than generalists. One reason is that their plants are also responding to climate change, right? So if the plant that they rely on becomes more rare or shifts in its distribution, that's going to affect the pollinator that relies on it. Species that are already declining are at risk of climate change or are more vulnerable to climate change. Again, species that occur at high altitudes and high latitudes are more vulnerable, again, because they have nowhere to go to move their habitat to track changes in climate. And species with small ranges or really specific habitat requirements can also tend to be more vulnerable to climate change. So climate change can affect species in lots of different ways, and then those ways can add up to have effects on pollinator communities. So I'm just going to talk briefly about two recent studies kind of showing this. This was a study published last year looking at bumblebees. So what they did was they looked at historically for each species of bumblebee in North America, and I think they also looked at Europe. They asked for each of these species, what is the historical climate conditions that this bee has been exposed to, and kind of assumed what its thermal tolerance limits were based on those historical conditions. And then they asked, where are the areas where these bumblebees are experiencing conditions outside of those thermal tolerance limits? So where is it getting warmer than they've ever experienced before? And where is that happening most? Okay, so what they found is that bumblebees, and so these are the warm areas, right? Are areas where temperatures are getting much higher than they have been historically. And so in those areas are areas where bumblebees are showing the biggest declines. So here we're seeing big declines in bumblebee populations, and it's associated with extreme temperatures that these bees are not adapted to. Another example with Western butterflies. So this study was just published a week or two ago by Matt Forrester and his colleagues. And they used several data sets. They used the 45-year long-term data set from California that I mentioned earlier. They also used community science data from iNaturalist and from the Butterflies and Moths of North America. And they looked at all this data for the past 40 years, and they asked, what's going on with these Western butterfly populations? And what they found were that most species were declining. And in general, they found that butterfly abundance in general is declining 1.6% a year for the past 40 years. So these big declines in Western butterflies. And then when they looked at the different factors and asked what's driving this, what they found was that the most important predictor for these last 40 years was increasing temperatures in the fall. And so their argument was that climate change is now starting to overtake some of these other stressors and being really important, especially in a landscape where maybe, habitat loss has already taken its toll. You've got a lot of pesticide use, but now climate change we're starting to see the effects more and more. It's becoming more prominent. We're getting warmer temperatures in the fall, and that's starting to cause these widespread declines in Western butterflies. So hopefully you've kind of seen the ways that climate change can affect individual species, and that in turn affects communities of pollinators and can affect pollinator biodiversity. And I just want to take a minute and talk about that, because I think there's a really important link between biodiversity and climate change. And I think that the fight to protect biodiversity and the fight to address climate change are the same fight. These are highly linked processes. We have to address climate change in order to protect biodiversity. A lot of studies out there showing that we know that biodiversity is declining globally, and we know that climate change can accelerate those biodiversity declines. So in order to protect biodiversity, we have to address climate change. But we also need biodiversity in order to help us mitigate and adapt to climate change. This biodiversity, this wonderful biodiversity on the planet, can help us address climate change. And just to be clear about my language, when I talk about mitigation, I'm talking about actions that reduce the causes of climate change. So the things that are causing climate change. For example, if we reduced deforestation in the Amazon, that is a tactic for mitigation. Adaptation are actions that address the consequences of climate change or the effects. So building a sea level wall to protect a town against sea level rise would be an example of adaptation. But biodiversity can help with both of those processes. So again, just to reiterate, climate change can cause biodiversity loss, can accelerate biodiversity loss. There are more and more studies coming out showing that the scale of biodiversity loss that we can expect with climate change increases with the magnitude of climate change. So again, keeping warming at 2 degrees Celsius or less, or do we have more warming? And if we have more warming, then we're going to lose more species. Biodiversity can help us mitigate the climate crisis. So harnessing the power of natural climate solutions can help us address this problem. So natural climate solutions is this idea that we can protect and restore healthy, diverse ecosystems, and that by doing that, we can make a real contribution to mitigating the climate crisis. And that's because healthy ecosystems sequester lots of carbon and they store carbon, and they do it efficiently. So this is something we can take advantage of. Grasslands, for example, grassland soils are better at carbon sequestration in areas with high plant diversity than in areas with low plant diversity. So you've got a weedy area, which is a couple species of grass, maybe it's not sequestering as much carbon as a a healthy prairie with lots of plant diversity. So this is one way that biodiversity can help us mitigate climate crisis by increasing soil carbon sequestration services. I also think it's interesting to note that in general, soil's ability to sequester carbon decreases at high temperatures. So if we want to take advantage of this, right, we get more bang for our buck if we do this now than if we wait 30 years when it's warmer, because soils can sequester more carbon now. Biodiversity can also help us adapt to the climate crisis. And so an example with pollinators is that there are studies showing that when you have an area with honeybees and wild bees, you get better pollination services than areas with only honeybees. So having those wild bees really enhances pollination. And that's important in terms of climate change because wild bees can be active at different times of day or in different conditions than honeybees. So you can imagine with climate change in a few years down the road, under conditions where it's too hot for honeybees to forage, if you have a diverse assemblage of wild bees, then those other bees can be active in times when maybe honeybees can't be active. So you have a better chance of maintaining pollination services in an area with a diverse assemblage of pollinators than in an area where you're relying only on honeybees. Okay, so what can we do? There is actually a lot we can do to help pollinators and help them be more resilient to climate change. And the good news is that many of these things also help us mitigate climate change. So we can restore and protect habitat. We can increase habitat connectivity for pollinators, and those two sort of go hand in hand. And then we can reduce those additional stressors that pollinators are dealing with that are interacting with climate change. So things like pesticides, disease, habitat loss, and so on. I just want to take a minute. So I do think that ag lands are a really important part of the solution to climate change. And in many ways, I think that farmers are on the front lines of climate change in a way that the rest of us just are not, like changes in big temperature swings or changes in seasonality, flooding, drought. Those things are going to affect farmers in a way that other people aren't directly affected, at least in the short term. So this is a really important issue, but I think that farmers also have the power to really lead the fight against climate change. And that's because sustainable farms with healthy soils can actually act as carbon sinks, where these farms are taking in more carbon than they're emitting. This is part of this idea of natural climate solutions, sustainable farms, which means that these types of farms that are well managed and cared for can really help to mitigate climate change and help us solve this huge problem that we're facing. The other good news is that many of the practices that we recommend to benefit pollinators also help increase carbon sequestration and improve soil health. There's this online tool to calculate carbon sequestration of different NRCS practices at this website. I think you're going to get a copy of the slide so you don't have to write it down. But for example, adding a 1/4 acre of windbreaks to cropland can sequester an additional 5 tons of carbon per year. So you can look at how these different practices can aid in carbon sequestration. And many of these can also help create habitat for pollinators and increase pollinator connectivity. So again, just reviewing, this is our 3-pronged approach: restoring habitat and habitat connectivity, and reducing stressors. So restoring habitat is important because the more habitat there is, the more pollinator species you can support. So the more habitats available, the higher your pollinator diversity is going to be, and the larger your pollinator populations can be. And that's important because in general, a larger population is less vulnerable to extinction than a small population. So that large population is going to be more resilient to bad years and those extreme weather events that are going to come with climate change. So that's why it's so important to increase habitats so we can grow these populations pollinators. And then habitat is also good for providing microhabitats, so these little habitats that are like maybe slightly cooler than the surrounding area or slightly warmer. Those are really important for providing refuges for pollinators during extreme weather events or heat waves, where they can find a place to be safe and kind of sit out those conditions.
Hey, Angela.
Yeah.
Really quick, do you mind taking your earbuds out for a second and seeing if we can hear you a little bit better without the microphone in your earbuds? Because there's some sort of like echoey feedback coming through.
You know what? My headphones are so old, they don't have a microphone. I'll try and unplug this. Does that help? I can just try and talk louder. Is that a little bit better?
I think it's just maybe the microphone in your computer. Go ahead and keep going.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. No, I hope you guys can hear me okay. Habitat connectivity is important for other similar reasons. I'm based in Sacramento, so this is one of the 2 California photos I snuck in. So this is a hedgerow along an almond orchard, and these are linear plantings like this are really important for helping pollinators move across the landscape. They act as roadways that contribute to pollinator conservation, but they also help mitigate climate change by sequestering carbon. So increasing habitat connectivity is important because it helps maintain pollinator diversity. When you have higher habitat connectivity, you can have larger populations. It can facilitate range shifts by allowing animals to move around the landscape. It also increases gene flow, which basically just means mating. Animals from different populations are able to mate and share their genes, which is important because in general, a population with lots of genetic diversity is more likely to have those genes that will make them better adapted to future climate conditions than a population with low genetic variability.
Angela, sorry. I think it was better with your earbuds in. I am so sorry.
Okay, no, I'm sorry. I have tons of Zoom meetings and I don't usually get complaints about this from my Zoom meeting, so hopefully, yeah, sorry, everyone.
No problem. Keep going, thanks.
Okay. And then finally, connected habitats can facilitate something called the rescue effect. So if you have a population and maybe the population's declining in this area, if the habitat is connected, individuals from another population can move in and sort of rescue that population and prevent it from going extinct. So there are a variety of opportunities for adding habitat on farms. Cover crops are an example. They're temporary habitat, but they still can provide a lot of important resources for pollinators and improve soil health. Prairie strips are great for providing linear habitat. They provide habitat for pollinators and beneficial insects such as predators that can help keep pests in check. But if you increase, it's a way to increase plant diversity as well. So it's an opportunity to increase your carbon sequestration benefits in those strips. Beetle banks are similar. You can increase plant diversity in these areas, increase soil health and carbon sequestration, but also include some resources for pollinators and provide some food for your pollinators. Pesticide barriers are another great way to improve habitat for pollinators and also climate mitigation. These trees suck in tons of carbon. They take tons of carbon from the atmosphere and store it long term, but also protect habitat for pollinators from pesticides. So reducing the pesticide stressor is really important. Field margins, this is my other California photo. So this was an area that was too steep to farm. So if there's marginal habitat that's not ideal for farming or in a weird location or something, you can turn it into prairie habitat and provide habitat for pollinators, which helps make them more resilient to climate change, but is also helping to sequester carbon and improve soil health, provide resources for other wildlife as well. And finally, hedgerows are another example. So this is from North Carolina, and it's just a mix of flowering shrubs and perennials where you can provide habitat, linear habitat for pollinators. So it's increasing habitat connectivity, but also providing carbon sequestration benefits. So Sarah's going to talk about some different programs to help you implement some of this on your farm if you choose. In general, we recommend using native plants and trying to aim for at least 3 species blooming from spring through fall. Diverse plantings will benefit more species and provide more benefits for the soil. We recommend including nesting resources for bees, including tunnel nesting bees like pithy stem plants like penstemon or wild rose. Bunch grasses are great. There's some species of bumblebees that nest at the base of bunch grasses, and then including butterfly host plants for species breeding in your area, like milkweed. And then the final part of that was to reduce pesticide risk, and other stressors. So climate change can interact with those other stressors. So you could think about maybe exposure to a particular pesticide might be sublethal in most cases, but maybe during a heat wave or a drought, when the pollinator is stressed out from those conditions, exposure to that same level of pesticide might become lethal. So you can use an IPM to reduce pesticide use. We have a lot of resources on our website that can help you with that. I think Sarah probably helps people with that with her work with the NRCS. It's important to reduce use of pesticides in your habitat and avoid neonicotinoids, which are a systemic insecticide that stay in the environment a really long time, and they also get taken up by the plant, but they are expressed in the pollen and nectar, as well as the other plant tissues. Okay, so there's a lot we can do to protect pollinators, and while addressing climate change, I think there's a lot we can do. I'm running through this. This is my last slide. I just want to emphasize why it's important to act now. I think there are a lot of advantages to addressing climate change now, rather than waiting, because the longer we wait, the harder it will be to reduce the effects of climate change and get to zero emissions. And the longer we wait, the more it will cost. We'll talk about the cost of climate change, but the cost of not doing anything is going to be much more expensive. If we act now, it will be cheaper than if we wait 20, 30 years. Acting now gives us more time to plan and adapt to changes like sea level rise. It also, if we wait to act, we narrow options for addressing climate change. For example, when I talked about how soils are better at sequestering carbon under cooler temperatures than warmer temperatures. So that's one reason to act now. Some effects of climate change will be difficult or impossible to reverse, such as the loss of permafrost. That can't be reversed. So, and then finally, if we act now, we can prevent rapid biodiversity loss and give species more time to adapt, just like we need more time to adapt to things like sea level rise or increased flooding. Species also need time to adapt to these changes in climatic conditions. Okay, next, Sarah is going to talk about some practical ways to make these changes on your farms, and then at the end we can take questions.
Thanks, Angela. And while Sarah's getting her screen pulled up, we actually have a poll that we were hoping everyone could answer really quickly. So, are you currently participating in, or have you ever participated in Farm Bill programs? And there's 3 selections there. So we'll just give it a couple of seconds for everybody to go ahead and answer that, and then we'll turn things. I'll provide the answers to those to that question, and then we'll turn things over to Sarah. All right, so it looks like about 76%, 78% of you have voted. Let's try to hit 85, just a couple more people. Come on, there's one or two of you more. All right, we'll leave it at that, 82% of you. So go ahead and end this poll and share those results. So we've got a majority. Well, it's kind of evenly split between no, I have never participated in a Farm Bill program, and yes, I'm currently participating in one or more. And there are 5 people, 13%, that have participated before, but they aren't currently. Thanks, everyone. And go ahead, Sarah.
All right, great. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do that. That really helps me kind of figure out where we are with kind of a knowledge base and familiarity. I know that there are some folks tuned in from various states, from the West Coast to the East Coast to the South, and some of these programs and what I'll talk about tonight is specific to Iowa, but can be applicable in other states. Since mainly I will be focusing on federal programs. So when I talk about the USDA, I'm going to primarily be referring to the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, and the Farm Service Agency. And they both provide programs for technical and financial assistance to address resource concerns. That always happens. Okay. So when I say resource concerns, that is a term that is used a lot, and it means a wide variety of different things. NRCS especially, well, both agencies really, they could be addressing air, water, soil, wildlife, pollinators, beneficial insects, all as resource concerns. And these USDA agencies are typically known for addressing water quality and soil health issues, but more and more in the last decade or a couple farm bills anyway, we've kind of been switching our gears and raising the expectations a little bit and addressing more of these wildlife concerns. So today I'll be specifically talking about programs in terms of pollinators and beneficial insects. So when we are out in the field, whether it's me as a partner biologist, I cover the entire state and am based in Boone County, or other partner biologists with Pheasants Forever or the Department of Natural Resources, or your NRCS local county staff, we're going to go out preferably to the field and have a pretty lengthy conversation about your site. What's the history of your site? Build those relationships, determine what your goals and objectives are. Recognize any existing habitat. It's easier to enhance what you may already have and kind of capitalize on that versus having to completely start from scratch. In some cases, you know, we may have both, where there's an area that we could enhance or diversify a little bit, and another area that we could do something completely new, like hedgerows or tree plantings. But what are those deficiencies, and how can we prioritize those things? I also think it's important to recognize that, especially for people that are new to habitat implementation, haven't done a prairie reconstruction before, you know, don't necessarily feel obligated to bite off a huge chunk. It's okay to kind of start off small and work your way up and get comfortable with these things, because we want to be sure that you are successful, because when you're successful, we're successful. And I just want to kind of talk about our baseline or our bare minimums. This is not a goal that I want us to achieve per se, but just to think about how our pollinator plantings or our diverse native habitat differs from some of the old traditional programs that focus primarily on just planting like smooth brome, for example. So the minimums for our pollinator plantings are 1 native bunch grass, 9 flowering plant species, and making their species spring, summer, and fall, and 1 legume. So that totals 11 species. It's not very diverse. That's not exactly what we want to see out there, but that is technically the bare minimum in order to qualify for these programs, whether you're working through FSA or NRCS. And monarchs are similar. So they have to meet those baseline pollinator requirements, and we have a little bit more. So we need to have 1.5% milkweed, preferably of more than one milkweed species if we can, and 60% of those flowering plants need to be nectar sources. So nectar is the carbohydrates and amino acids. They basically fuel our pollinators, and they're critical to monarchs in order for them to have the energy and the capacity to migrate south, for example. So it's another step up, but again, we oftentimes see mixes that have generally anywhere from like 20, 25 species. So this is just a low bar. I don't recommend it per se. But if you can increase your species to upwards of 30, you're in a good boat. And I think, that's a really diverse planting that will be able to support a wide variety of pollinators and beneficial insects. Okay, so now getting into the nuts and bolts of some of these programs. So through FSA, they have the Conservation Reserve Program. This is probably the most popular, most well-known. In Iowa, we have 1.76 million acres of CRP enrolled as of December 2020. So this is a huge workload for our staff. Primarily, this is what they're working on day in and day out. There are a variety of different programs offered through CRP, but most commonly, you're going to participate in either the general sign-up, which is offered usually one time a year for like a short window. Applications are ranked. It kind of has its own unique process. Currently in Iowa, the general sign-up is still open, which is rather unusual, and we don't currently have a cutoff date. But most of the time it's like a month and a half, pretty small opportunity. The continuous sign up, just like it sounds, it's continuous throughout most of the year. People can come in and sign up at any time. And the practices can overlap between general or continuous, but there's, some are only in one or the other, and there can be different parameters for each of those. But they both are about 10 to 15 years, depending on the program. There's cost share for establishment, you get annual payments. Some practices require a maintenance activity like burning or tilling, something of that nature. And to my knowledge, I don't think we're cost sharing on that anymore, but it used to be referred to as mid-contract management. So for those of you that are familiar with Farm Bill programs, that's what I'm referring to now as a maintenance activity. These are some examples of wildlife-friendly CRP practices. They certainly aren't all of them. And depending on your state, some of these may be popular, or there may be others that we don't use here in Iowa that are more applicable to where you are in the world. And the most obvious one is the CP42 pollinator habitat. So that specifically calls out, that's the main objective, is pollinators. So switching gears to NRCS programs, so they're offering the technical and financial assistance. We have the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which is EQIP, and that's basically a stepping stone to kind of get your feet wet into conservation. And there are a wide number of practices that cover a huge range of resource concerns, from cover crops to reducing tillage to spray regimes, pest management, pollinators, et cetera. And many of the practices that Angela has already referred to are offered through EQIP. But it's different in the sense that you only get that one-time flat rate payment. And they're shorter, generally, 3 to 5 years. There are some practices that are longer, going upwards of 10 years. We also have the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP, through NRCS. And this is intended to basically kind of reward producers who have already been pretty well experienced with conservation practices on their land. So it's kind of a graduate level cost share program. It differs from EQIP in the sense that it looks at the entire operation. So it takes into account just the entire routine. So you'll have to share information with NRCS, like your spray schedule, your tillage, your crop rotations, all of those things. And basically a tool determines where are resource concerns, where do they still exist? And what can we kind of where can we put things to still be making a better difference for conservation on the land? You know, you may have a few things checked off, but there's still some others that we can tackle. Generally, these are 5-year contracts. The really big difference between EQIP is that you have the opportunity to renew and you have annual payments. CSP is pretty popular. I work with several producers who are participating in CSP, and you know, it's a little different from CRP in the sense that, you know, requires at least half an acre of habitat for every 40 acres, and there's specific language that says, you know, we should be making an effort to protect habitat adjacent to insecticide use. And we also have to be meeting all of those prereq pollinator planting requirements. And the Monarch habitat enhancement is similar. So half an acre of habitat. And again, explicitly mentioning that when we are planning these practices, we should be thinking about insecticide use and trying to avoid or decrease that potential exposure. So the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program, also known as ASEP, there are several programs under this umbrella, but today I'm just gonna kind of go over the Wetland Reserve Easement Program. This is one that often is not really thought about in terms of pollinators or pollinator habitat, but the Iowa NRCS and other states have been making a conscious effort in recent years to incorporate native plants in all of their restorations. So in Iowa, when we are working with wetland restoration projects throughout the states and with our contractors, we are planting monarch habitat with those projects. So we're using native plants, and if native plants are on the landscape, chances are, you know, beneficial insects and pollinators are going to benefit from that. But these also, this ASEP is a lot different in the sense that these programs are really long-term conservation, potentially forever conservation with permanent easements, or, you know, 30 years, 15 years. And most of the time, at least in Iowa, you'll find these within the prairie pothole region or along river corridors, and basically put into areas that are not productive and are really prone to flooding, or more so will be more prone to flooding probably moving forward. Or folks that just want to retire from farming and, you know, put it into something forever. So getting outside of the federal umbrella, we do have other programs available to us within the state. And I guess first off, I should mention that locally, there may be certain CRP practices or other initiatives for your county or your region of the state or your watershed where there's specific targeted species or other resource concerns that want to be met, or priority concerns. The Iowa Habitat and Access Program is administered through the Department of Natural Resources, the DNR. Basically, you are opening up your land for a short window of public access, and in return, the DNR is managing that land. So folks that are an absentee landowner that have CRP, if you're willing to open up for the public, it could be a great way to not feel like you have that burden of managing that land, because they're going to help take care of some of those things for you. The Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship has the Resource Enhancement and Protection Program, known as REAP. So each county is allotted X amount of dollars to do conservation practices like installing windbreaks or doing native prairie plantings. Prairie Partners is administered by the Iowa DNR, Pheasants Forever, and the Iowa Native Seed Growers Association. And it's a program that really targets non-producers. So if you have an acreage or you're a landowner, you want to do a diverse prairie restoration, but you would like to have some sort of cost share assistance, they will cost share 50% of the seed cost. Seed cost ends up being one of the more costly expenses in terms of doing reconstruction. So that's just one way that we can help some of the folks that might not be eligible for Farm Bill or other state programs because they're not a producer. And really what's best is just to contact your local USDA service center. If you don't already have an existing relationship with them, or if you're not currently participating in the farm program, I suggest stopping in and kind of seeing who your local folks are. You can go to farmers.gov and look up any state and any county to see where your service center may be. And again, they're going to know the specifics of all the programs and if there are any certain special ones for your area that aren't offered everywhere. Okay, and that's a wrap on a quick overview of programs, which can be kind of overwhelming. But I just lastly want to close with our resources. These are just some examples of some newer ones that have come out within like the last year and a half. And I also just want to do a very quick plug. We had a brand new publication come out today. It's just online, but it's Farming with Soil Life, I believe is what it's called. And it's pretty big document, but it looks amazing and really gets into thinking about the interaction between farming and soil invertebrates. So that's super exciting. And I highly recommend checking it out on the website. Shout out to our thinkers and supporters. Our members are awesome. They make up a third of our revenue, or nearly a third, and are really instrumental in allowing us to do what we do, and also to our other larger donors and partners. If you're not currently a member, really hope and suggest that you consider becoming one. And with that, we will take questions. And thank you everybody for tuning in tonight.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, let me go ahead and add you on the spotlight here, Angela, and then we'll start some questions. So there was a follow-up question for you, Sarah. Could you give some estimated costs involved with some of these programs?
Yeah, that's kind of a loaded question. So it all really depends on like what program you're doing. So let's just say someone is going to do a CP, like enroll in CRP and do a pollinator planting. Let's say you're going to do 10 acres. If you have a diverse native seed mix that has roughly, let's say 30 species at a minimum, you could be looking at, $200 to $300, at least in Iowa. That's kind of our range, kind of off a whim estimate for seed cost alone. So that's already a pretty big chunk. Plus, mowing could be, depending on who you know, or if you have your own equipment, that could be, $15 an acre to $30 an acre in order to remove some of the vegetation, or to do it as post-establishment. And I apologize, I'm kind of going out of order, but just trying to think about all the stuff that you have to consider that has a price tag to it. So site prep, you're going to have to likely, if you're not, starting from crop is probably easier because you're not likely going to have to spray anything. So there may not be any cost associated with that. But if you're going from like a smooth brome stand and converting into something diverse, you're going to have to do multiple steps of potentially spraying or tilling and planting a smother crop, or however you go about that. There's costs associated with site prep, costs associated with seed, cost with establishment, and you do get cost share for some of those things, but it can be quite expensive.
And is that what an FSA employee or somebody like yourself helps guide a landowner through, is navigating what those steps are and then what the costs are along the way?
Yes. So in terms of Farm Bill programs, I guess programs in general, the NRCS office is going to always be your technical assistance. So anything that has to do with planting, site prep, management, long-term management, seed mixes, things like that. People like me and NRCS employees and other partner biologists, we will help you with all of that stuff. If you are enrolled with CRP, they're going to handle all the financial stuff, and they're not going to get into anything technical. That's as some people have told me, not my job. So they can break it down and let you know, you're going to get X amount of cost share for these, things like site prep, seed mixes, mowings, your establishment mowings. They do pay for a couple of those. If you're with NRCS and those other programs like EQIP and CSP, they will be your financial and technical people, and that you will also have an idea with EQIP how much money you're going to spend up front, and then basically be reimbursed with that flat rate cost share with EQIP, for example. So you don't, they should help you at least have some sort of ballpark estimate to make sure that you can afford what you're about to do. And I think that also, starting off small, if you're concerned about things, may be easier.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. And then ISU also has a website to help farmers and landowners find local technical assistance. So like you, and I'll just put that link.
Yeah. And they do also, I think, I can't remember the exact link, but there should be information too, like annually on how much contract work costs. So like how much to expect to pay someone to mow or spray, etc.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Question for you, Angela. We had a question at the very beginning. Somebody asked, do we know anything about the interactions of exotic honeybees and native solitary bees? Is there evidence that the honeybees are crowding out native bees?
Yeah, so honeybees are actually from Europe. They're not native to the US, but they're very important to our agriculture. It's not settled, but there is more and more evidence coming out showing that honeybees can outcompete native bees, many of which are solitary bees. And so we do recommend some caution in terms of keeping honeybee hives in natural areas where you might have high diversity of native bees, just because they can tend to outcompete those native bees. Yeah, anything to add to that, Sarah?
Yeah, we do recommend having a buffer between the honeybee hives and like remnant areas where, again, there's likely to be a high diversity of pollinator, native bee species. Yeah, I mean, and I think we have recommendations too for X amount of hives for, I don't know about X amount of
natural
space.
areas. Yeah, I think it's a certain number and 4 miles away. The other thing I should have mentioned, in addition to competition, is that the diseases that affect honeybees can also be transmitted to wild bees. So that's another potential negative effect of managed bees on wild bees.
Great. There was a question when you were talking about how, habitats, latitudes and altitudes are kind of changing and pushing things upwards. Somebody asked, they said that they're using local ecotype seed from regional nurseries, and they've got like 40 to 50 species. And they wonder, are all of these, if you build it, they will come type of species good enough as growing regions change, or should we plant from the next tier of nurseries to our to the south, or plant even more species diversity to help combat climate change, hedgerows, shrubs, and so on?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question that we wrestle with all the time. I think the best thing we can do is try to incorporate as much diversity as we can. If you're able to get local ecotypes from several populations, that's at least better than one population of ecotypes, though that's not always possible. I mean, it's difficult sometimes just to get native seed from a local ecotype, let alone a variety of locations. So that's one thing you can try to do. There is a planner. I'll look up the link and send it to you. For trees, it might be more advantageous to try and look at what the future climate's going to be like in terms of something long-lived like a tree, as opposed to something like an annual grass that maybe it's not as important. You could try and source a small percentage of the seed. If you're getting a lot of seed, maybe a small percentage from a lower latitude. Though, I mean, the trick is that it's highly species specific. Some species will do just fine in the future, other species will not. And so it's really hard to predict what the right thing is to do. And so our recommendation generally is just try to get as much diversity as you can. And I mean, even in terms of picking plants to account for future situations. I mean, what do you do when you have more drought and more flooding? And so just those mixes that Sarah's talking about, if you have 30 species, you're probably going to have species that will do well in one of those situations, and then you're covered. And so just, yeah, relying on that biodiversity. It's a great question. And I wish I had a solid answer for it, because it's something we grapple with a lot.
Yeah, I think the science is still out on that one, but yes, ensuring that you have as much genetic diversity within your planting by sourcing local ecotype from multiple places is probably the best bet to go now.
So now I've got a couple of questions regarding like practices and how they influence the life cycles of insects. So two of them are the same question. Fire is important in establishing prairie pollinator habitat. Is annual burning harmful to the pollinators? Is there a best time to do burns to make sure you're not interrupting any life cycle stages?
Yeah, so I would say that fire is essential to maintaining diverse native habitat. And there are times, I think switching up the timing of the burns is really critical so that we're not selecting certain species that favor certain times. You're just kind of going to ensure that that balance is in check. I know it's very common here in the Midwest to always do spring burns. People are already burning ditches and burning areas right now, which is fine by and large, but the real main concern is just ensuring that there is some habitat, so you're not burning everything all at once, rotating spots out. There are some people that suggest annual fires are not harmful to insects, and there's people that freak out a lot when you talk about annual fire. So I think one way to kind of mitigate that is to always have refugia somewhere. But I would also argue that there are certain times, I wouldn't argue that you should burn every year. Our recommendation is switching that up from every 3 to 6 years. But there are ways to time your burns if you want to be really conscientious, regardless of your interval, of insect populations where the relative humidity is going to be higher. So it's not going to burn as hot. You could burn when the vegetation is still a little damp. So it's going to be really slow and it may not burn everything. We don't always do a lot of fall burns around here, but I think we should be kind of flip-flopping back and forth there in our grassland systems. Some people are experimenting with summer burns because that was, you know, prehistoric times. There's not a lot of research on that currently. But I think switching up the timing, the seasonality, making sure that there's refugia, ensuring that you have you know, your back burning, which basically is into the wind. So you're doing it as slow as possible. You don't just have this raging out of control fire that doesn't allow anything to escape or have anywhere else to go. Our woodland areas tend to be overwintering sites for a lot of our bumblebee species, for example, are thought to be kind of within the woodland edges during the overwintering months. So that can be a little trickier, but again, it's just ensuring that you're not burning the entire piece that you have. And also keeping in mind your landscape connectivity. So where are you in the world? What other habitat is near you? And how big is it? If you have a really small piece, like in your backyard, you have a 1/4 acre or whatever, it's probably fine to go ahead and just burn that whole thing 1 year, wait 3 or more years and burn it again. So hope that's probably more than you bargained for, but I could talk about fire for a while.
Very helpful. The other question having to do with sort of interrupting this one's nesting habitat. So Angela, you mentioned cover crops and reducing herbicide as good options to support pollinator health. With most cover crops needing to be sprayed or tilled, couldn't the use of cover crops negatively impact pollinator populations by the increased use in herbicides or by tilling in the ground, which could impact the nesting habitat of those ground dwelling species?
Yeah, and I'm based in California where a lot of people don't use cover crops, and it always alarms me to drive around in the winter and there's just bare soil everywhere. So it's bad for that, and in terms of just we get a lot of drought, and so in terms of allowing the soil to take in more water and retain that water, it's important. It's important practice. In the almond orchards, they just mow like in between the rows. So I'll let Sarah address that because I think she's more familiar with the practices in Iowa versus California.
Yeah, so I think if I remember the question correctly, it was that cover crops could potentially be detrimental to pollinators.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, and I think in Iowa, the vast majority of the cover crops that we're using are not really in places where there's probably a lot of pollinator activity. You know, our crops do not rely heavily on pollination. You know, corn is wind pollinated, soybeans could take it or leave it. So by and large, I don't think it's going to be extremely impactful, although all of the things mentioned is true, like as far as tillage. But I don't think there's going to be a high diversity of pollinators taking up those spaces. But if you do have cover crops that flower, I think our recommendation is basically to, if you're able to allow them to bloom, and you know, you could be providing some services there, and probably having other habitat nearby would be your best bet. Because I mean, with restoration and with habitat, there's kind of always going to be those plus and minuses, or those catch-22s. I mean, the fires, you know, another example, but we have to have fire on the landscape, and you know, crop rotations have to continue.
Thank you. Another question, do different species of milkweed provide different levels of benefit to monarchs?
So some species have more of the toxins. So they have these cardinalides that the monarchs can take up and then use them as a predator defense. Some milkweeds have more of those than others. That could be, if they have really high levels, that can be slightly negative to monarchs. But in general, we just recommend trying to plant a variety if you can, if there are multiple species that are native to your area. Because of that, and also because they might be flowering at different times or green at different times, so that allows monarchs to use them. But in general, I think that if you have native milkweeds, like any of them are going to be pretty good.
And I had a question about, I think, Sarah, you talked about nectar plants. How do you know if a plant is a nectar plant? Like what determines that?
Yeah, so that's basically, I mean, I'm not like a super botanist, but the phenology of the plant. So some flowers offer more pollen resources, and some have pollen and nectar resources, or offer more nectar. So like wild bergamot is kind of a big nectar plant. Milkweeds are considered nectar plants. Goldenrods, asters, they can offer some pollen and nectar. But yeah, basically the phenology, and you know, the critters somehow know the difference. They can find each other.
Great. Angela, when you mentioned that carbon sequestration declines in higher temperatures, is that a result of plant reactions to the soil temperature, or is it a result to a change in the soil biodiversity related to their reaction to the higher temperature? I think they're just wondering in general, why is it that that happens?
That's a great question, and I don't know the mechanism. I suspect it's probably the soil microorganisms in there, that their efficiency of processing those, the processes that they're doing are slowing, but I don't know for sure. I will look it up before I talk about it again so that I can answer that question next time. That's a great question.
I believe that you're right on that one. Yeah. All right, what would be this one's for you, Sarah. What would be, or where are the best resources for prairie pollinator management?
Well, I would say there are a number of resources. In Iowa, at least, we are fairly spoiled in terms of things tallgrass prairie. We have a lot of resources and on basically all the steps. So the Tallgrass Prairie Center is an excellent website to check out just locally. They have a ton of research, ton of publications, tech guides. Xerces, we have lots of resources on tech guides as far as site prep, establishment, management, maintaining those diverse stands. ISU has resources. I mean, there's a number of them, and I guess it would be helpful to, I don't know if this is helpful to the person who asked, if they're not from Iowa, but our website's a good place to check out. We do have the Pollinator Conservation Resource Center, I think is what it's called. Yeah, and you can kind of regionally figure out where you are in the world, and then there will be resources that are applicable to your region on a variety of different topics.
And I think that some of these, one of those websites was actually, the Pollinator Resource Center was linked at some point during the chat tonight. So we are coming to a close. I know that Angela and Sarah have shared a couple of resources in their presentation that we've shared in the chat, and that they mentioned that they would like get back to us on. So what I'll do is go through the chat and grab all of those links. And if there were things that Sarah and Angela shared in their presentation that we didn't put in the chat, we'll try to gather those up. And tomorrow morning, I'll put all of those in an email and send out to everyone so that everyone has some access to those, and they're conveniently located in one place. Sarah and Angela, thank you so much for rounding out the Farminar season this year. This is a really interesting presentation, and I appreciate it. We had some really great chat in the box throughout. So thank you everyone for logging in, and watch for the recording. If you want to reference it in the future, we'll post that tomorrow at some point. Have a good night, everyone.